February 27th, 2023. As this is a land use code work session, the conversation will be mainly between the commissioners and the staff up here, just so we all know. I'd ask you all to join me though and say the Pledge of Allegiance.
Yes.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Commissioners, I'm about ready to turn this over to Mr. Holman. Is there anything else you want to address before we get started?
No, we can. We don't necessarily have an official agenda on this meeting, so we've all met with you individually. So we get dug into a 30-minute PowerPoint here when we've got specialized things to discuss. So.
If I may, Mr. Chair, I didn't intend to necessarily do a PowerPoint. I have a red line draft based on comments I've heard from you all individually, from the public, from the Planning Commission, and the main things I wanted to walk through those. Those are edits to the certified copy that the Planning Commission certified in November, and we can walk through those. I had this PowerPoint if you want to see kind of what I had drafted for the public hearing tomorrow, if you want input as far as for that presentation tomorrow night. If you want a presentation tomorrow night.
We do need a short one, yeah.
Okay. If you want, I can run through that at the end, but
Let's
I think
do
the
that
main
at
thing
the
is to
end.
get through the document.
Let's
That's
do
okay with
that.
you. And then, so I've drafted language, I've highlighted it to try to track along with it. If you can go to the Word document, Kate. And so the yellow highlight represents what the Planning Commission reported on, the lot size variance and the recycling. Blue highlights are the other changes since then, and looking for your input. If you want to change it or delete it, or if there's anything else as I go through it, please flag it, and we can. Kate can type it in, and that way we have a record of it in this document. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So with that, I'm going to scroll to the first highlight. There are some highlights in the table of contents. It's related to where there's been some changes within the text, and so this is just a function of the changes within the text. At the appendices, though, I want to stop there for a second and highlight. So there's a green highlight there. That document, we have not found that document was actually adopted. It was referenced as an appendix in 2021. And so the recommendation would just be to take it out at this time. It's not a document that would be appendicized to the land use code. The other two, the rubbish chunk ordinance and the personal cannabis, don't need to be appendicized to the land use code. They don't really have they act independently, and so we could take those out and don't need to have those as part of the appendices.
Questions there, commissioners?
No, that was fine. I promise I have an appointment set up with the eye doctor at the end of this month.
Can you
So,
make that larger?
I'm gonna, but so maybe if you could just, the green part, what was that exactly?
It's design and installation guidelines for underground irrigation, water
Conveyance.
conveyance.
Okay.
Perfect. Actually, can you maybe increase the font size also?
It honestly, Carl, it's not gonna matter at this point. That's good, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so we're in chapter 1 now.
Yes, this is chapter 1, section 5. We went through, and there were still some references to septic that we've gone through and changed to on-site wastewater management or treatment systems, OWTS. This is one of those. Keep going.
That's page 23.
Page 26.
Thank you. Yeah, if you could just kind of mention what page number we're on, that would be helpful. Thank you, Kate. So in this, this highlight, yellow highlight is language that would be deleted. This was in response to the request to put lot size variances back into the land use code. So this language had said that, you know, that the Board of Adjustments would review variances other than lot size variances. So that language is being stricken.
Okay.
Change we all agreed
Table 2A,
Page 29.
page 29.
Let's back up before we get to that point.
Okay.
Let's go back to page 27. On powers and duties of the planning commission.
Mm-hmm.
So we discussed the preliminary plats.
Yes.
And I still, I'm not comfortable with the board not being able to review those. There's sometimes that we probably don't see eye to eye with the planning commission, and there's been times that restrictions have come forward that we didn't agree with and didn't feel should be on there. So conditional use permits.
So what this list is the types of applications that go to the planning commission, the types of actions that go to the plan. Not that they are the approving authority.
Okay, so but all these are these in statute now? Preliminary plats is in statute.
As far as what that reference, as far as the planning commission being a decision-making body for preliminary plats, is later in the land use code and is part of the process of preliminary plats. I would have to defer to Mr. Bear as far as if the statute does not allow that to happen. I looked at statute. I did not see anything that would prevent that.
Okay,
If that's your discretion as a board.
So, you know, then perhaps, you know, what the wording needs to say, where you've got, it says including the following functions, it should say, you know, review and recommend to the board commission on the following functions.
Okay.
Because this language would say,
on. It could be interpreted as the final, where the BoCC has it.
So after shall, just maybe say shall review and recommend?
Or after the comma, including.
after the comma, it's whenever it says including the following functions, it says, and add review and recommend.
Yeah,
Ahead of
including add, review, and recommend on the following functions. Reviewing and recommending. Are you in track changes?
Is that counterposed to all authority? That's what I was looking at. It says shall have all authority, and I thought that's what you wanted to, that's what you're sort of addressing. We're just a recommending body, so we really don't have the authority. We just have the ability to review and recommend.
Right, but that language, including the following functions, I would just like that to be clear there.
Okay.
So reviewing and recommending on.
For the following functions.
Or review and recommendation of the following functions?
No.
Okay.
For or on either works there.
Any
Okay.
questions on the four functions there, commissioners?
There's a fifth one on the next page. Master plan.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Master plan statutory anyway, so, is that, technically, we don't approve that, well, we can approve it, but we don't have authority on that anyways. Okay.
Okay. Going to table 2A.
So page 29.
Before we go to chapter 2, is anything else in chapter 1, Commissioners? Anything in your notes?
That was covered in that section one.
Okay, chapter 2,
Please go ahead.
page 29, table 2A. There's been some question as far as agriculture being allowed in the A5 zone. We added the language back in as far as small-scale agriculture and large lot residential. There's also been some question about the 2.5 acre zoning designation that was added, and rather than it being residential 2.5, that it be agriculture 2.5 acres, and having the same language as far as the small-scale agricultural uses.
And we still have ag, it's listed right in all zones, correct?
That's correct. Table 2B has it as an allowed use in any zoning district.
Okay.
Any other questions on table 2A, Commissioners?
Okay. Chapter 2, section 2.
Page 33.
This is where we start to address the concern of permitted use, the term permitted use. And some of the conversation we had in Planning Commission is changing that to site plan review. And so instead of a P, making it an S in the table. And so if there's concurrence to that, there's a number of changes where that would be affected. And we'll highlight those as we go through the document.
I'm still. We've had this conversation a couple times now, Carl and I. And I'm still not understanding why we can't leave the A's in there. Allowed by right does not mean illegal. Allowed by right still means you have to get your permits. You still have to get everything that you need to be legal. So I'm really having trouble with not having the A's in there personally.
Well, if I may, the next part there that's also highlighted was to create that distinction. Is allowed without review, where the site plan review is allowed with review, as outlined in the development application ordinance.
So 2A, it still says allowed.
So kind of jumping, not directly hitting the issue that Commissioner Schuch was talking about, development application ordinance, the plan doesn't have that repealed. So, correct?
Well, that hasn't been the direction at this point, but that's a conversation we can have at this juncture. If that's the intent, then that's different. With the development application ordinance in place, which is what these changes were reflecting, is we have a development application ordinance. That development application ordinance requires a review. It requires site plan review, access permit, assigning an address, septic, and then identifying a checklist of other things that might be required with that. Generally, that's what the ordinance establishes. If your board wants to repeal that or change that, then a lot of this then there's a different context to this conversation. Right? Would you agree with that?
I would. My understanding was that the substantive and relevant language from the development application ordinance was going to be integrated into this document, and the development application ordinance would be repealed.
There was one conversation about that. If that's the case, yes, then we would not want to refer to a development application ordinance that is going to be repealed. Yeah.
Well, it is.
But did we capture the essence of that ordinance in table 2B?
Yes.
With the site plan review?
The changes that the planning commission went through, the change to the Ps, was in that context of the development application ordinance. The uses that, where you have new residential or commercial development, which is where the development application applies, that was the intent of going through that table 2B and changing them from A to P, P being the ones that needed site plan review. And so now it's kind of evolved into, instead of calling it permitted use, calling it site plan review, which then aligns with the development application ordinance language. Also, when we get into this further later in chapters 7 and 8, where it's going through the process, we have integrated the steps that are currently part of the development application ordinance. So functionally, your land use code could replace the development application ordinance. But in that case, then we would not want to refer to the development application ordinance in this section, which is, I think, what Mr. Bear was getting to.
Because the subject matter of the development application ordinance is so integrated into land use, obviously. I think it should be in there. And I'm sorry, I understood that it was, and I didn't, okay. So, having said that, so that would be my recommendation. If the development application ordinance goes away, the relevant language goes into this document, which it sounds like it basically already is, and then on the back end, we can just repeal the development application ordinance.
But then, instead of the language here referring to the development application ordinance, we could refer to chapter 8, where
Sure.
it is.
Sure, wherever it needs to. Having said that, the ordinance would, even if you decided to keep the ordinance, which I'm not recommending, it would have to be updated anyways because the state has classified some of those violations. So we're in the process of redoing all ordinances anyway. So I don't think it makes any sense.
Changing from criminal to civil.
Correct. So I don't think it makes any sense to keep the ordinance, but.
I'm gonna agree on that end also. You know, some of these things also in the rural recreation hospitality category, we've got, you know, short-term rentals listed as an SP here. And I'm not sure why that's needed. I mean, that should be.
Can we get back to that one yet?
Well, this is still in the same, this is table 2. So.
In section 2, item 2, paragraph B, the very last, not the very last, middle of that paragraph says, these uses are allowed with review as outlined in the development application ordinance. Would be my recommendation that we change that to reference the chapters.
As outlined in chapter 8. Instead
Does that
of,
work for you guys? I'm hoping that makes it cleaner and more user-friendly.
well, we could say in this code, it would be, because it's in, in chapter 7 and chapter 8.
Right. So what I'm asking Mr. Holm is whether or not that reference should just say as outlined in this code or something like that, rather than specifically.
That's fine.
If there's specific references, it does help the reader to know exactly where to go. We can
Hypothetical as an
do
example,
a
chapter
parenthetical.
7.
Yeah.
However you want to write that.
Yeah.
However Kate wants to write
Okay, Don, jump into what you were talking about.
Well, you know, we've got a lot of these here that have shifted from A to an SP now.
We're talking about table 2.
In the table 2B. And, you know, some of them make sense, you know. The one we talked about, kennels, used to be A's and then P's, has now shifted, I guess it was A's and L's, and now it's shifted to SP. And that one I understand, because a kennel, we're talking voices to neighbors, affected neighbors. That's one of the calls I get regularly of neighbors of kennels in my district complaining about kennel noise.
I think when we were going through it with the planning commission, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt if you were.
No, you're fine, you're fine, go ahead.
When we were having the conversation with the planning commission, going through and where A's got changed to P at the time and now P being changed to S, had to do, again, with the development application ordinance, had to do with new residential and commercial uses. And so that's where those changes were made to reflect. But also, the planning commission spoke more to the effect that, like, does it need some type of review for water? Does it need some type of water use? And I'm looking at TK to correct me if I'm wrong, but.
No, you're right on.
Okay.
That's what came up.
That was the main focus of where those changes occurred. But of course, I mean, that's why we're here now. If there's anything you want to change differently, you mentioned short-term rentals. That was to kind of follow the same of the guest ranch, and other similar uses like bed and breakfast, guest ranch, to try to align those as far as the type of review that would be applied.
But what problem are we trying to fix with these? On bed and breakfast, short-term rental, guest ranch, what problem are we trying to fix?
I wouldn't say that it's a problem. That it's, can they just go do it without having the water that they need? Can they change or add that use without changing their access to versus a single residence access versus
on the short-term rental, I don't know where that wouldn't change. Short-term rental is the same as a single-family unit, so I don't know where that would change. Bed and breakfast, possibly, but are we going? I mean, we don't regulate a family with 6 kids. A family with a couple of teenage drivers is going to see a lot more trips than a bed and breakfast. We're not regulating that. So
when you look over at the single-family detached and accessory dwelling unit, those are site plan reviews, again, because where you have the water for when you put in a residence. So it's the same level. It's the same level of review. Not that you need a new additional review, but it's a similar level of review.
What would you move that to, Don, if you had the opportunity?
I would personally, I would change it from, bed and breakfast, 4 guest rooms or less allowed, bed and breakfast, 4 guest rooms or more, SP would be what I would do, because you're talking 2 different levels here. Short-term rentals, I believe those A's. You're not seeing any change on those. Guest ranch, probably do something similar to bed and breakfast. If you're exceeding a certain number of people, then yeah, let's review it. We want to make sure that you got enough road and everything to cover it. But if you're not exceeding a certain amount of people, you're not really any different than a single-family dwelling.
Okay. So you want to say 4 rooms or less than 4 rooms? I mean, less than 4 rooms would be 1 through 3. 4 or less is 1 through 4. For all 3 of those. And then when you get into the lodging, it's 10 or less. It becomes it's a limited use. And then the resort conference where it's more than 10 becomes conditional.
We start talking more than 4. Then we're talking actual utility infrastructure needs. Okay? I totally get that. You get so big, you got to make sure you got proper access, you got proper roads. You don't want to cause a safety issue for people trying to get to and from. I totally get that. I just, I'm just not seeing that kind of a need for evaluation on especially short-term rentals. But the smaller bed and breakfast or the smaller guest ranch, I just don't see that need for review.
Okay, so I'm trying to think of the tiers. Do you want it 4 or less allowed?
I would say 4 or
and
less.
And then 5 to 10 limited, like the lodging, and then more than 10 conditional.
I think that would be a comfortable place for me. I don't know about these guys, but.
Mike, where are you at on this? Is this a reasonable solution to no impact, low impact, high impact?
Well, safety is a major concern, and the water. Because if you've got a lot of guests and guest rooms there, are you gonna have the water facilities, the utilities available at their needs? But yeah, I can go before.
I've got 13-year-old twin boys, so I can tell you my water needs for shower time are pretty strenuous, so.
Your boys, your
but I-
teenage boys shower? 'Cause-
You know, it's one of those things, you pretty much, you have to threaten to take something away to get them in the shower, but then once they're in there, they don't wanna leave, so.
So is it a question of using what's there existing versus the number? I mean, I'm thinking somebody had a 5-bedroom house and they're not really expanding the house. The house is probably built with the regulations for 5 bedrooms and bath. I guess if they're converting it into a B&B or a short-term rental and they're not really expanding the existing structure, then you're sort of saying that should be allowed. And allowed doesn't, I don't know, I always have a hard time saying, allowed doesn't mean without review, right?
No, allowed is without review. It still has to meet the standards. It just, there's no review
But I mean, if they're,
attached
you
to
know,
it.
if they need a plumbing permit, like an electrical permit, whatever, they've still got to get them. So just because they have it allowed, just because it's allowed in this chart, doesn't mean they are.
They
void
still have to
from
get
the zone.
access, address,
Yeah.
address
If they're-
septic,
if they're doing some-
electrical, plumbing,
Right.
with state permits, whatever it might be.
And this is not an ADU, this is an existing or new single dwelling.
Right, if they're taking an existing structure, residence, and converting it into something more of a commercial use, and they're not changing that structure, whether it's 3 bedrooms, 5 bedrooms, and we've got some places along 92 that have got probably 6 bedrooms or 7, and some of the old 2-story stuff, that they could be converting, it wouldn't be a problem as long as it was sized for that. And
And I think that's what we're trying to find, that threshold, that where it, you know, it
Yeah.
changes the four
And I'm trying-
rooms versus.
I'm trying to give an alternative that as, if it's in an existing structure, and not tied to the rooms, right? I mean,
And if
it's
they're
already
building-
been there.
Yeah, if they're building a new structure, they're gonna have to have a design for that.
Well, a new structure would be sort of an ADU, that would then come under S&P, site plan review.
Or
Still
the
allowed.
additional units.
Yeah. I think where it's confusing is just because it goes to SP doesn't give it a higher likelihood. Nobody's ever been denied. You know, we talked about this earlier.
Well, yeah,
Every application that's come through has been approved.
You know, I guess here's my challenge is being in a business that gets inspected regularly based upon the code. The code's never the problem. It's who administers that code. So my point with this is to make sure that we have it as minimalistic as possible so if we have that wrong person that's administering this code that decides they want to make life hell on everybody, there's limits to that. And that's, you know, I always have to fall back on that level also.
Yeah, no matter what you do, that's always going to be the case, right?
And once again, yeah, you can't
individuals-
defend against that all the
Yeah,
time.
we can't figure that out.
But you can do as much as possible.
Let's circle back here. What I would recommend then for us is to put in these categories and these tiers as Carl suggested and see what the public says.
Okay.
Okay.
So 4 or less would be allowed, no review.
That's an
Still
A.
would still need to meet the standards, but 5 to 10 guest rooms is a limited use, and more than 10 is a conditional use.
Limited or site plan review?
Well, I was just going by based on lodging right now, it's limited, but we can change it to site plan review.
4 to 10, I don't think limited is a bad thing because, you know, you are talking, you know, those infrastructure needs. I don't think that's, at 4 to 10, there's, you know, the chance of somebody taking a 4-bedroom bed and breakfast, and family grows and they turn it back into family housing, that's pretty common. That's why you gotta be careful. Somebody starts talking the 4 to 10 mark, not very likely that somebody's gonna go out and adopt 10 kids and turn that into a family dwelling. I'm not saying it can't happen. I'm just saying it's not likely. But, you know, you start talking 10 rooms with that many trips per day, You know, can the road handle it? Is the access safe? Is there line of sight? Those types of things. So,
And then in hotel, motel would be a 10+,
Correct.
and that's limited. You okay with this tiering?
Yeah, and you know, the neighbors would have concerns when you have a 4 to 10 bedroom activity going in there, the noise levels. Bed and breakfast too, a lot of them are, sometimes have guests in there that can stay up late at night, so the neighbors need to be aware of that also. Which is why you don't want to get too many in there in a compact type of a site where nothing can be controlled reasonably. Because you don't want the neighbors calling the sheriff each weekend when the new group comes in.
I think that was generally the tenor of the planning commission is if you're changing the use from what was typically residential into now more of a commercial use by renting rooms or doing Airbnb, it's changing the nature of the use, and that's, you'd want people to know.
Okay, you want to just highlight that block
Which is why I think we put it
in
in
green, so
SB
you can go
and
back
stuff.
and clean that up. Thank you.
I would also point out to the commissioners on page 35, under commercial land use category, home businesses, there was 3 categories.
Correct.
We're now down to 1, 2.
2.
And 1 is just home business allowed in all zone areas, and then home business impacting to neighboring properties is limited.
Right, and there will be more definition to that in later in chapter 2. And this is where it's highlighted, as well as you go to the top of that page, okay? And this will be picked up later, but changing manufactured home park from 3+ units to 5+ units, which aligns with when Dolan gets involved in they manage it at that point, the state.
So that's a state function.
Right.
So just to make sure everyone, Chair, so the 4 falls, it's up to 4, and then 5 to 10, that's what.
Right.
Okay.
Well, I said 4 to 10, didn't I? So, I'm sorry.
Well, I just wanted to make sure
I know,
that
that's why we're casting
the
sorry.
girls know, so,
Clarification.
and then that applies to, okay, you go back down. That applies to the bed and breakfast, the short-term rental, and the guest range, all consistent.
I tell you guys the same thing I tell my kids, listen to what I mean, not what I say, so.
Okay, anything else on page 34, 35 for table 2B? Mike, do you have anything? Done? I think we've covered all the. On page 36 then.
So, you know what, let's do look back, just a little bit. And I mean, the likelihood of it happening are nil and none, but we got truck stop, truck wash. And we've got slashes across the board on there. The odds of it happening are nil and none, like I said, but I think some C's across there would be better because none of us have a crystal ball as to say there's no way you'll ever have something in that zone there. Our zone just changed so much throughout this county. I get nervous anytime I see a slash through something that's not allowed. I'm like, do you really?
I'm not seeing that.
It's under utilities, communications, mining, etc. It's on page 36.
Yeah.
Still part
just,
of table 2B.
Yeah, just.
We didn't change that, but we can certainly undo that.
Yeah, and that goes back to the earlier code, and I understand that. But I think we just need to look at where we've got slashes and think, is it really something that we're never ever going to see happen in that zone? And then look at the map, and I don't know that we can say that that's the case. So, all right, sorry, go ahead.
Okay.
So Kate, can you capture C's across there?
Yeah, C's across there.
I'm okay with that.
And honestly, I can see C's across
Even in the
the-
smaller.
the previous one, the automobile fueling or service station, I can see C's across there also.
Even in the res 1 acre?
Absolutely. Somebody puts a gas station next to a compact subdivision, I could absolutely see that possibility.
So just a clarification, if it has a slash, does that mean somebody can't come in and ask for a rezone?
No, they can come in and ask for a reason, well, but in this case, it's pretty much not allowed in all the zones except rural industrial commercial. So they would be asking to change the zoning to the rural industrial commercial. That's what they would do if they
Well, and
wanted to do that.
and once again, and that's.
So,
what, you know,
I think what TK is saying is rather than change it to conditional use, you could leave it as prohibited and know that if you want to do that, it would also require a reason.
Right, but do we wanna, I mean, do we wanna have spot zoning like that? You know, that's the other end of that question.
Yes, it's been on my list, spot zoning and split zoning, but
No, and that's,
we're just starting zoning, and almost anything we do in Delta County will be spot.
exactly, it's spot zoning now, so do we wanna make it spotty or?
Until it fills in and becomes less spotty, yeah, it's a question you have to think about. But again, just because it has a slash doesn't mean somebody can't do it.
Right, it doesn't mean they can't do it, but, you know, it severely limits their options.
Just means that we would want to see them go through a rezone.
Right.
And then that process would be public hearing and all those things. Just
But then, you know, then once again, I mean, do we really, you know, we can't see every possibility out there. And do we really want to have a rural industrial, you know, someplace that it doesn't fit because somebody has the need for that?
okay.
The main thing is, what is the message you want to convey to the reader of the land use code? That it's a permit process. Conditional use is a permit process. I go to the planning commission and the board, and there's conditions attached to it. Or these are the areas we really don't want it, so unless it's zoned or rezoned. And I hear what you're saying is don't want to close the door, so come in, we'll go through the permit process, and it may not get approved depending on where it is or the situation, but you have that process to go through without having to rezone it.
So, you know, we, in my opinion, John Q. applicant that comes in your door, you know, we're giving him one of two answers. We're either giving him a yes if or a no unless. And I'd like to focus more on a yes if throughout this code than the no unless. You know, that seems to me it might seem semantical, but it's a philosophy that I think can get us a lot farther.
And again, where the discrepancy happens is you've got a commercial use or type, like the truck wash, that they're gonna have to get permission to run that type of unit from the water companies. We don't control that. Generally, what we've found is most of the private water companies have denied any type of commercial use.
Commercial use of the water.
Period.
I've been telling people in Delta County for a long time that that's our primary growth control in this county is water.
Almost exclusively.
Because
That's right.
outside the Tri-County area, there's a limited amount of water.
Right. Even if we say C or slash, we don't really control that.
Right. But there's no way we can't give them an option if there's an option.
Okay, let's get back to our table 2B here. Anything else on page 36 that jumps out to you? Carl, is there anything you want to bring to our attention?
No, I think that.
So, Commissioner Supis, did you mention something about fueling?
I did, yeah. On that previous chart, you know, we have automobile filling a service station.
That's on page 35.
On page 35.
Did you catch that?
I think
I
we
thought
should
Kate-
have C's
Kate got
across
that.
there. Kate got that? Okay, yeah, that was.
Anything else on table 2B at all, Mike? Page 37 then.
The first change is a footnote to table 2B, again, recognizing that home business is just one category versus the accessory business use and cottage industry. So that edit. Then in subsection C, instead of restricted, to change regulated by ordinance, and that would just be commercial cannabis and pre-HUD mobile homes. The reference to personal use cannabis would be removed, as well as the junk rubbish ordinance reference. That way there's no conflict of junk rubbish with land use, it's its own law and regulation.
And another reference to OWTS.
At the bottom, yes, sir.
Keep going, Carl.
Okay, so next page, page 38. There at the top, you see there, we found a typo, added code, this code, and then did a rework of item 3, principal land uses. Again, trying to remove the permitted and focusing on the site plan review. So in subsection 3 there would be worded as allowed use, site plan review, limited use, conditional use. And then the same thing in subsection 4 below that. Just removing permitted, primarily removing permitted and changing to site plan review.
Questions on that, commissioners?
Okay, page 39, use of RVs as a temporary dwelling during construction. Planning Commission did have a little discussion about that, 12 months versus 24 months. Recognizing that once the RV is attached, so if you put your septic in, you have your water, and you connect your RV, there's no time limit. It becomes a permanent residence at that point. So if you're constructing a house at that point and you've hooked up your RV, there is no time limit. It's just if the RV is there and it's not hooked up to the septic system or the permanent water yet, then you have 24 months for that to farm worker housing, again, permitted use, the site plan review, the using RV type structure as a principal use, changing individual sewage disposal to OWTS. That was a old term. And then in item 4, again, changing from 3 to 5+ for manufactured home park.
And that aligns with the state?
That aligns with the state, yes. At that point, it is under DOLA's review.
Questions on page 39, John?
Page 40, just the one changing from permitted use to site plan review.
So let's, the changes made in advance from the 21 code to this plan here.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we spent a fair amount of time on events when we developed that 21 code. I'm trying to these special events are a pretty good economic driver. You bring in this number of people from out of town, they spend their money here. I mean, that's good primary income for this county. And I'm just curious where, you know, some of the additional restrictions we added in there, what we were trying to accomplish.
What we're trying to accomplish is identifying when it becomes an impact. Less than 150 people or less, just an allowed use. There's no review, allowed without review. Once you get to 151 to 500 people, having a site plan review. Just again, there's a number of standards here, and when that was drafted in 2021, it didn't say if it was allowed or permitted or limited. It just had criteria that had to be followed for events. So what we were trying to do is, and based on some of the I'll call it concerns that have come up through, with events that have occurred. We haven't had any that have become a code enforcement case, but we have had some concerns raised through that. And so we were trying to find that balance of what just go do, you have a few events, less than 150 people, not a big deal. If it's a private event, not an issue at all, honestly. I have somebody in my family getting married on my property, we don't regulate that. That's they're just going and doing. Public events are bigger types things, and then you have these special events that are more, again, special, temporary. But when you start to get to the 500 people or more, you have a lot of traffic.
I get the 500 people. Most of our back county roads aren't designed for 500 people and more traffic.
We have one case right now where we received a complaint because the people they live in a smaller subdivision, and they created a second unit that they've been running events out of. Well, everybody just parks in that neighborhood. The septic isn't designed for that intensity of use. So again, we're trying to find that, and these numbers, can certainly change, but that's what we're trying to identify with the graduating of the numbers.
So are they parking in the street, or are they parking on the right of way?
Well, they're parking in the street. But when you talk about parking for a use, parking for event, the code is speaking to off-site or on-site parking, not on-street parking. So while it's a public road, when you have a use, the intent is that you are managing that within your property, not impacting others around.
Have we had any public comment on this particular section of events?
Not that I recall.
Did you go through the notes and see if we can find it? DK, has the planning commission had any comments on this?
Not on events. I mean, I
We
don't.
talked through it
We talked through it as a group, but we didn't do it as a result of complaints that we're aware of. 150 was a lot of people.
Still a lot of people.
A lot of people for like the minimum threshold. So I mean, if you're doing a house concert or something like that, there are not many homes that could handle 150 people. But there are some events going on where they are parking, in through the neighborhood, and hopefully we try to see if they have a HOA, let that be enforced that way.
I will say
Well,
that actually.
I don't think we want to get to the point that we're not allowing parking on the side of a public road either.
It's not that we're not allowing parking, it's the use. When I develop my property, don't I have to develop it to support the use that I want on my property, rather than putting it onto the public road, public right of way?
Well, they weren't on the public right of way, they were in the street. You could have the public right of way, the street might be 30 feet, you've got 10 feet on each side, and they're in the street.
So generally, if somebody's having a wedding, and they're going to use the neighborhood, the neighborhood knows it's a single event. It's never been a problem. But if they're doing something weekly, monthly, then it's sort of a change of use.
And Wendell, I do recall actually now having a conversation with Eli about events. You mentioned about having existing events at a property, how that would work. The grandfathering. Eli, you can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, and I think, and in general, certainly we've chatted about this several times, but also in general, the impacts of events and just looking at why tightening it up, why tighten it up, why not leave is. I think we kind of discussed that and encouraged the county to leave it open as is. As you say, I think it's actually kind of allowed by right as is. It's not restricted as permitted or conditional, limited. So I think we've kind of discussed that as important for tourism, important for dollars coming into the community.
There's not really a way for attendees to know whether if someone's pulling off the side of a county road, whether they're in county right of way or whether they're on private property. A lot of our roads are just prescriptive, which means we have prescriptive right to the road and maybe a little bit of the shoulder, and that's it. So there's really no way to functionally tell.
Well, and if you look at
that's
the
that's
standards.
challenge.
Yeah.
That's a challenge here. I mean, I can see both sides of this discussion here. I mean, if, I take care of my roadway in front of my house, and I don't know that I necessarily want a bunch of people coming in and tearing it up and have to fix it all the time, but I just get, I want us to be very cautious in this section because it is a big deal. It is a huge economic driver for this county, so we've got to be.
No argument there.
We've got to be mindful of how we approach this.
And the standards that were established with the 2021 does speak to access and circulation and parking. The street must have adequate capacity to serve. The parking must be sufficient to accommodate peak demands. It goes on, parking may be provided in remote locations, provided that if parking is provided more than 800 feet from the boundaries, an appropriate level of shuttle service is provided. So those standards were there. What we're looking at is when do we need to look at it to make sure that we aren't having a problem? They haven't, again, going back to why we have land use codes is because not everybody contacts their neighbors ahead of time of doing some of these things. If everybody did that and the neighbors didn't have a problem, they addressed the neighbors' issues, we wouldn't have the need for any review.
So Commissioner Shipus, would it, if those numbers were a little higher, say 250, would that address some of your concerns?
Honestly, John, I don't know what the answer is. I'm not pretending to have the answer here. I just think it's something that we just need to make sure that
But that was the basis for changing this.
Yeah, and we're making a distinction as a commercial event. People are doing this with regularity.
Correct.
Where there is a high impact.
Right.
And if you're holding a commercial event, you should be responsible for the impacts that you're developing. Let's flag this. I'd like to see what kind of public comment comes up here.
Okay.
Including impacts to the county roads. I mean, we treat, in theory, the county as a person, meaning as a neighbor, so that I know the public has the right to be there, but if you, like this winter, if people parked all over the county road and then left, those county roads would never be the same. I mean, they're getting hammered by the moisture, and in one day that can be ruined. So the reason it's reviewed, so just we can notify that, hey, there's going to be an event here, and it may take maintenance afterwards. So we treat the county as sort of a neighbor, just like CDOT, if the state highway is a neighbor.
Is that a reasonable way to move forward on this one, commissioners?
once again, I don't pretend to have the answer to this
Well, see
question.
what the public comment is. You don't know where you're parking correctly until the guy comes running out his house and saying, "Get off my lawn."
Anything else on events before we move on? Hearing none, we're on page 42, then accessory business to the use of the home business.
So this, the part that's highlighted on the screen now, this is consolidating what had been accessory business use of the home and cottage industry to that upper part. The rest is all strike out, taking out what had been there, all the standards for accessory business use of the home or cottage industry. So the way it would work as it's drafted, there's 4 criteria clearly be incidental and secondary to the use of the dwelling for dwelling purposes and shall not materially change the character of the residential use or of the neighborhood by excessive noise, lights, traffic, or other disturbances. Utilize access included as part of the dwelling unless otherwise permitted. Be allowed one unanimated, non-illuminated flat wall or window sign, and outdoor storage must be screened from public view, parenthetical, from public road. A home business that creates significant impacts, fumes, noxious odors, excessive noise, dust, and or traffic shall be subject to limited use permit with a public hearing. Otherwise, it's an allowed use that meets those 4 criteria.
Questions on this one, Commissioners? This is quite a change. This is actually much easier to standards to meet for home business.
They're more definitive than what was there in the 2021 as part of the definition, but still allow a lot of flexibility.
All good there? Because the rest is all strikeout, clear down the start of section 4.
Correct.
And I think, these home-based businesses, a lot of people rely on them for added income, which is great, and it's to protect them, but also to protect the neighbors, because you don't, just like the sign, there are some people who are overzealous that will put up a neon sign type of thing just to get that extra percentage of business. And so it's to let the homeowner know what's going on, plus the neighbors do have some protection on them, because they're the ones who are going to be complaining about anything that isn't business legal.
Right. I mean, that's the premise of the land use code, is trying to find that balance between what I do on my property and what my neighbor does on their property, and what the expectations from both perspectives, both rights.
And from the planning commission side, I think we recognize that most, if not all, the businesses started at home. And we wanted to make sure we encourage it, not have too many regulations, just when they get past that home business into something else is the issue. But I think this allows everybody to start whatever they want at their home. That was the intent.
Hearing nothing else, we're going to move forward. We flag that one also. I'd like to see what public comment comes up on that one.
Okay.
Thank you.
The next change I have is on page 48, unless you have something prior to that.
Anything between that would be pages 44, 45, 46, and 47.
Okay, on page 48, relative to density, based on some comments as far as how people were reading this, suggested some changes. The idea here is what can I do on my property, say if I don't have access to water? Still have the ability to put a single-family residence and an accessory dwelling unit. So the way I've tried to make that clear is, even if limited to hauled water, each parcel or lot shall be permitted at least one dwelling unit and one accessory dwelling unit, subject to site plan review. Additional units must provide proof of water not hauled, and then access, wastewater, etc.
Go back to the last thing you said about the hauled water.
So basically, if you have a lot or a parcel, and it doesn't have, there's no other water, you can't get a well, there's no spring, there is no other water source, water tap, anything like that. That you, even with a cistern with hauled water, you can still have a single-family dwelling and an accessory dwelling unit. If you want additional units, then at that point, you need to have proof of water, not hauled water. Now, there's also the section relative to cisterns that's been amended, it's later in the land use code, that addresses that as well, and also includes the ability to request a variance for additional units on hauled water, but that's in another section of the code. This is just, what this is trying to get to is, again, what's that minimum that I can expect, even if I don't have adequate water or access or something, you still get to build a single-family residence and an ADU on your property.
So, but this could also.
Not that there's no development, you can't build on it at all, period. That's what we're trying to get to.
But the language in this also basically states that, you're still only allowed one, even if you have proper water.
That's not the intent.
Well, and that's the challenge here, is we need to make sure that we're not putting an intent out there that's not meant to be, because, we had this discussion a million times when we developed the 21 code. And that being, if, Farmer Jones wants to add another house to his property for his kids to come live in, he's got adequate water, he's got adequate access, he's got proper OWTS, he's not affecting irrigated land,
This isn't saying, I'm not reading this that they wouldn't be able to do that.
I'm not either, Don. It's that second sentence, additional units must provide proof of water, not hauled, access wastewater, power. If Farmer Jones has additional water, a tap or spring or well, there's no issue. That's how I'm reading it. I heard very loud and clear, particularly in Crawford, that the municipalities see a very high risk in providing hauled water services or standpipe services.
Absolutely. After what we went through a few years ago, it would be absolutely irresponsible to add a whole bunch of cisterns out there when my phone was blowing up a few years ago when Hotchkiss and Crawford started shutting off their fill stations.
And there is a variance process
But that's-
for systems.
I just, the way I read this is it's not necessarily specific to cistern-fed properties. That's my challenge. Is it saying your parcel is limited to one dwelling unit?
So Carl,
So maybe it's just the way I'm reading it, but,
Is there a different density section that addresses when there's plenty of water, no issues with water? Is there a different density section?
Yes.
Because this section.
Page 51,
is just
additional
referring to-
residences or communal living.
It's
Yes.
only referring to hauled water, at least, as I'm kind of.
and I know that's the intent. I just want to make sure that we're not creating something by not having it properly worded.
So, John, there's the two sections. There's the additional residences, communal living, which starts on page 51, and then the cistern discussion, which is in chapter 5. Haven't got there yet.
And once again, I just want to make sure that we're not, that this language is clear, that we're not creating another restriction that we don't need to create.
I understand. So if you're reading it a different way, then how?
No, what paragraph are you on?
Still back on the density.
Page 48.
48 1B.
48, and maybe it's all the hacks and slashes and colors and Maybe it's the fact I don't have my glasses on, but I've read this a number of times outside of today. I don't know if that helps. But yeah, I just want to make sure that we're not creating a
Understood.
limitation that we don't need to create.
And I know we've got public comment on this.
So as long
And
as.
that's what this was trying to address.
So after tomorrow night's meeting, let's concatenate those particular to this section
Okay.
and see if there's any better word.
Okay.
Does that work for you guys? Okay.
And then page 50, under the design standards for manufactured home park, a couple changes there. One, not sure where the language came from for the skirting to generally blend with the appearance of the unit, because we don't do design review. But so we'd be striking that. But there have been a number of comments relative to fire protection and the requirement for a fire hydrant. So that's been changed where each part shall install fire mitigation improvements to satisfy applicable regulations of the appropriate fire agency. The fire agency will make recommendations. Fire hydrant is needed. They may recommend that if there is the infrastructure to support it. But if not, then what would be the alternative?
So it allows the applicant to be somewhat creative
There's
on
flexibility
providing
there.
that
Correct.
protection.
Work with the fire
As a
agency to come
recommendation.
up with a solution. Yes.
Questions, comments on design standard 6, fire protection?
And that is an issue even on the Tri-County water system, because of the 4-inch line won't handle the residents and the fire hydrant.
To meet the new NFPA standards, you pretty much got to be fed by at least a 6-inch line.
6-inch or greater, yes.
But there are alternative fire suppression methods is what this is really addressing, that they can put in storage, we're looking at one with pond,
Yeah, a
You know,
pond where
just
they could,
work with the
they could
fire
use
departments
pumps
to let them know they got water.
Some up north of Cedar Ridge that have a cistern and a gas-fired pump on it, just to
Yep.
Correct.
cover that, so.
And as long as the fire department knows and is okay with it.
Yeah, even if it's a smaller
We're okay.
line that's feeding a cistern, the cistern's fed, you have whatever amount of gallons that the fire department wants, then you have your fire connection off the cistern is another alternative design.
Okay, anything else on 50 or 51, guys? Again, there was some WTS cleanup here. Page 52,
Farm worker housing, it referenced water, hauled water not exceeding 90 days. However, when you look at the definition of seasonal for farm worker housing, it's 6 months, 180 days, so we changed that to align with the definition of seasonal housing.
that's a good catch. Anything others? Any questions or comments? Okay.
Right. Next change I have is not for ways. Chapter 3, unless there's something before that.
Anything in chapter 3, Mel?
In the rest of chapter 2.
So, problem is, three different revisions, none of the page numbers are on them, because I've got red lines here, red lines there, so it would be after multifamily, we talk about accessory dwelling units. And this
What's your section?
Page 50. 51.
Oh, you know what, sorry, that was my bad, that was at the bottom of that page and I missed it, so, yeah, page 51.
Relative to the ADUs?
Relative to ADUs, I still have questions with 1,000 square feet. You know, that's a crazy number just to pick out of the air.
I've seen codes from 800 to 1,200 square feet, defining ADUs, yeah.
I personally think we need to take the floor area factor out of it.
Just take item A out.
Just take item A out, yep.
TK, Mike, what's your thoughts on that?
I mean, it's still
I know the
still
planning
listed
commission
as
did talk around that a little bit. And then
as a secondary use of the property. It's still, I don't know, it just seems.
But maybe overcome with 1,000. It's hard to say until you put it to use and someone builds a 5,000 square foot ADU.
Well, then the main house might become an
Well, I guess
ADU if it's
that's
less than 5,000.
There's no way to know it if it's an ADU if you don't have some metric to it. That's what I think that's what
I think you've got the metric. If it's not an accessory, if it's going to be built larger than an existing home, then it's no longer an ADU. I think.
How do you define it?
Yeah, I don't know. I think we're putting restrictions for the sake of putting a restriction, and I don't know that it's necessary.
Is that square footage you put in there if the ADU is bigger than the primary living room? Somebody will test it.
So the total floor area of the ADU shall not exceed the floor area of the main primary residence?
Something about that. And people want clarity, not definition.
It's also subject to a variance, presumably.
Yeah, it's a standard that the variance could be requested to exceed 1,000 square feet. Yes.
Or whatever it says.
Or whatever, yeah.
You guys want to see what kind of public comment we get on this one?
So leave it for now, but flag it, or?
Yeah, my position to take it out, but that's, like I said, it seems like restriction for the sake of restriction, so, but that's, let's see what happens.
Okay, just highlight it in green.
We will come back to this one after the
Is
public
there a
comment.
section about communal living?
Yes, that's just right after this, additional residences or communal living.
And that's the only change there is the OWTS reference.
There are different types of development. You know, I've seen a design where there's a central structure that has like the kitchen and general living quarters, and then there's multiple bedrooms around. To me, that's still one single-family residence. You don't have other kitchens, you know. And what the water purveyors typically look at is when there's a secondary kitchen, another kitchen. That's when they look at it as being a secondary unit. So then is it a secondary unit or is it accessory to the main unit? The idea of the ADU is it's connected to the same infrastructure as the main residence. That's why it's accessory, secondary, the size, because it's really adding on to that existing residence before it becomes just another unit under the additional residences.
And this is the only section that references communal living.
Yes.
Any other questions on chapter 2 before we move to chapter 3? Excuse me.
Let's get down to number D, community uses. Is it still listed as that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Community lands, community uses, community land shall not be located in wildfire hazard areas. If you look at our map, that's gonna restrict 90% of this county.
Where are you at, Tom?
I am on
53.
page 53. So. And I realize this falls back on the 21 code, but, just,
That was one that hadn't come up, and so it wasn't addressed at this point, but as long as we're going through it, if that's something you wanna
right,
do,
like I said, it
we're
was,
here.
it was just something I'd flagged, because I've been reading through this, it just seemed like it probably kills out almost anything, so we probably ought to maybe,
I'm not sure why that was put in there to begin with.
well, I think it was, I
Well-
think it was meant to be that, you know, there was some wildfire mitigation possibly, but I don't remember.
So community land uses, provide community gathering places or services such as places of assembly, education, or internment of human remains.
Yeah.
That's the definition that goes with that.
So, there's a whole lot of area out there that you aren't gonna get to have a church based on this code because it's in wildfire areas. I just think we ought to, change that wording.
I'm not sure we even need it.
Right, just eliminate that.
Just strike the.
Yeah, just strike it out.
I think you have enough other standards within the land use codes.
I have no problem taking it out.
Take it
Let's
out.
flag that. Can you get that one, Kate?
Highlighted in green.
Kate's all over.
Don, what else you got for chapter 2?
I'm working on it. Just for my sake of curiosity, in the utilities, communications, mining, energy, transportation, disposable uses code. We have a lot of numbers in this section, like in the location section, talking about 70 feet from property lines, 200 feet from residential structures, 500 feet from residential structures. Do we have, I'm just curious where these numbers are coming from, just so.
Just looking at other similar, zoning codes, land use codes. And just, so we're all looking,
It's
What's
top
that?
of page 56.
These would have come from the 2021, I mean, from the original one, Carl.
What's
We-
that?
We didn't change these, did we?
No, this was added, this was,
No,
the
this is-
solar was the added section.
So where I got the solar regulations was, I talked to COSA, who works with the solar industry. They identified 3 other county land use regulations, and then I worked on that to create this. I sent it to COSA and other people that have expressed interest in the solar, and have them look at this, and these numbers.
Okay,
So,
like I said,
I mean,
I'm not
an expert
pretending-
either,
I'm not an expert, I don't know what's right, what's wrong, I'm just,
Right.
just so if somebody asks, I know where it came from. so.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Then into the airstrips, airfields thing. So I once again, on the airstrips, and this was something that was in the prior code, I don't think we need to put an acreage number on that as a restriction. I think we just have something, as long as it meets the FAA guidelines, it shouldn't matter. I mean, if they buy a long strip of land that meets the guidelines, it's not 80 acres, what do we care? And then.
You have the setback standards in there as well, the 1,500
Right.
feet. right?
Right,
So
as long
you're
as
gonna
they-
have to have enough space for that.
As long as they can meet the standards, what do we care what size of acreage their parcel is?
I just agree.
So would that also pick up then 4A for the landing areas, landing pads?
Yeah, so landing pads is the same thing. Landing pads, I mean, we have existing landing pads that this prior board has approved that are much smaller than 40 acres. So, once again, as long as it meets the FAA, I don't know that we should be concerned. So I would take out on the landing pad, I would take A and C totally.
So in 3 airstrips, just deleting subsection A, and then in
And then
item
in
4,
item
landing
4,
pad,
Yeah, under landing pad
Deleting
4, we take
subsections
out
A and C.
And what about under 2A? References 200 acres.
for an airport.
The airport's a different animal, that's not a, and, but I got no problem with us taking up the acreage requirement. Because
So you don't want any setback requirements for landing pad
as long as it meets the FAA setbacks,
okay?
and, most of these guys, they have their landing pad that's, plenty of them throughout the county that are fairly close to structures, because they want to land it and pull it into a structure. It may be in an area closer to a property line, so as long as it meets the FAA guidelines, I think we probably do the tolerance. And then the airports, I would have no problem taking up the 200 acres out of the airports. As long as they meet the FAA standards, let them figure out how many acres it takes.
You want us to check with Armstrong to double check FAA would have specifics
Yeah, we can check.
for the smaller.
Yeah, we can check. I'm pretty sure thinking of some existing locations that are less than that kind of acreage now.
And in table 2B, airport airstrip landing pad is all limited use with public notification.
And so if it's not regulated by the FAA, you don't want to have any setback for the neighbors as far as, helicopters landing right next to their property, or?
It's a
I'm
limited
just
use.
Limited
asking,
use,
I'm not-
It's a limited use.
they're gonna have to ask their neighbors anyways.
Okay.
Does the FAA regulate, like, ultralights?
Yes.
I don't know if they do.
I think that when that came up with the Garnet Mesa hearing, there was a lot of conversation from the applicant saying they weren't getting
They weren't
anything from FAA.
regulated.
They weren't
not
regulated,
regulated.
right?
Ultralight's different.
And runways.
So where we can delete reference to acreage and setbacks. Just leave it to the review process. Okay.
I honestly think that's all I have for chapter 2 now.
Mike, do you have anything else?
I was just going back to these solar panels, we have on page 55, should be located at least 70 feet from property line. Some of these older houses, they built the house close to the county road, so they wouldn't have to shovel snow to get in and out. I just wonder if that solar panel sitting next to the house is going to be within 70 feet. I don't know.
Well, but if it's within that property.
So these standards are only controlling within the property where the solar facility would be located. So if you live next to it, you know that it's going to be, the panels would be at least 70 feet from the property, from your property, your shared property line.
This is industrial, isn't
This is
Yeah,
commercial.
The commercial level,
These are commercial.
right.
This is
Not the individual
We don't
personal
regulate the
solar.
residential.
That's an allowed use, that's not subject to these standards.
it? Does that make sense, Mike?
Okay. where it says commercial scale, we need it.
Right.
Right.
That's why this ordinance, or that's why the section is added just for the commercial use.
If we're ready, we're gonna take a comfort break, 5 minutes, before we jump into chapter 3.
Hour and a half, seems like we've been at this for 5 minutes, I'm having so much fun.
Easy. Okay. We're gonna take a quick break. Okay.
So, a lot of the stuff I'm getting, I think there's no concern leaving it.
Oh, yeah.
Appreciate your,
Yeah, we've had calls for a couple of runaways and strips, and some of them gotten into that. Well, I don't have any acres, but I can make it work. You can ask for variance.
One next to me.
They're still there.
It's okay. It's arbitrary, there's something arbitrary. You can have something opinion.
Yeah.
well, I was actually going to be here.
Yeah.
They're right here. Okay.
So we're getting to kind of deal with we're at flag it, or we don't have specific changes, so I'm making
I'm trying to make this.
I know, but you're busy over here, so it's approach and we can.
I'm doing my best. I'm on like 3 pages now.
Okay.
So,
And then we'll
Just checking.
Congratulations. Great. I got this like greenhouse attached to the whole back of it. So I got my seeds started. Yeah. It's about time.
All right, everybody, we're going to pick up again. Thank you for a quick break. Mr. Holm, we're at chapter 3, buildings and structures.
Yes. So just in table 3A, changing residential 2.5 to A 2.5. And then this yellow highlight.
Hey,
is-
folks, if you need to have a conversation, we ask you to take it in the hallway, but thank you.
So this yellow highlight is what you'd ask the planning commission report on, the variation to lot size. And it's not written the same way as it was before in 2021. There was a couple pieces are relative to conforming to the other requirements of the code. And then the size and configuration doesn't impact irrigated ag lands. It does not interfere with wildlife habitat. That's highlighted in blue because there's been some conversation of whether or not we want that as a criteria in this section or not. The other components of the variation of lot size is that as recommended by the planning commission, it would apply in the A20 or A35 zones only, not in all the zoning districts. Recognizing that those that are in A5, the 2.5 or 1.0, they're already smaller zones, and they can also request a rezone if they want to have, smaller lot type of development. That'd be a 2-lot subdivision, a minor plat. One of the lots would be less than what would be required, hence the variance. The other lot would meet the minimum zoning, so in the A20, at least 20 acres, A35, 35 acres.
So that's one of the things I kind of have a challenge with here, because our zoning map is a little bit checkered, as we've discussed many times. When you zone a county that had never been zoned, it's tough to say, yeah, this A20, you may have something that's zoned this smaller lot size than that A20 because of the zone. But yet we really don't want to change the bulk of that area that's in that A20. So do we really want to limit the ability for this variation when, we have that zone for something that doesn't fit when we zoned it? We've got a lot of A20, A35 out there that's got 1 acre lots on it.
And you would be with the variance too. By approving a variance, you have 37 acres, you split off 2 acres. That 2 acres is still zoned A35. We're not rezoning that. So we're still continuing to do that through this process.
Yeah,
Unless they apply for a rezone.
Well, if it's in the middle of a lot of A35, you don't really need to do that. They have their variance so that allows them to have that.
But you're saying that, that it still needs to meet the existing zoning. One of the remaining parcels.
One of the remaining parcels, right.
But it may not meet that existing zoning to begin with.
And so the question is, do you want to keep cutting those lands up? If the idea is that you have...
If it's not hurting ag.
Well, if it's not hurting ag and they have the ability, there's also the clustered subdivision process, which allows multiple lots, there's no restriction on the number, less than the size, without a variance.
But the clustered aspect gets pricey with all the extra requirements to meet that clustered subdivision. Like I said, I'm thinking about that guy that's got 19 acres. He may farm the parcel next to him, whatever. He's got 19 acres, he's in an A20 zone. Needs to move his kid in to help take care of the farm. And because of the way this is labeled, because it was zoned for something that is not fitting already, he cannot do that.
That would be correct in the way this is worded. And so the question to you as the policymakers is how much you want to keep cutting the lands up versus having an exception. There's an exception process here.
Well, and once again, when we developed the 21 we had hundreds of hours of meetings, and this topic came up as much, if not more, than anything else discussed. And I still have the belief that as long as we're not tearing up the ag land, we have to, sometimes what keeps ag alive is people being able to bring another property on. You know, what we have to be careful of is, you know, this, you know, I moved here now, shut the gates, don't let anybody change what's here. And that becomes our challenge here, you know, this, you know, how much do you want to let, you know, you've asked the question a couple of times, how much do you want to let this land continue to get broke up? Well, yeah, nobody wants it to break up. Sometimes it's just a matter of fact, because if he can't keep that farm alive, then the whole thing is clustered, and you've got 100 houses. So
He can still do it. I mean, this doesn't say he can't do it. He would just say, I want to apply a different zone to it, A5.
Well, but okay, but then we've got a whole area of A20, and you're going to tell him that we want you to spot zone this an A2.5 because you want, it doesn't meet this section of the code.
Yeah, but our maps are never gonna be perfect now.
Well, I realize our maps are never going to be perfect, but does this lead to more imperfection in the maps?
This leads to more, to me, this gives them flexibility. And if it truly is a problem with the map, let's get it rezoned.
Right now, if they're doing that, they're going to a variance process. And what we tried to figure out was how do we allow people to do exactly what you're saying, break off the ground,
Right.
without having to get the variance. And that's what this language allows to do. And the Board of Adjustments was saying, we're getting every one of these splits because
Oh, no,
we're
I
regulating
know
for
that's-
variance, and that just seemed to be counterproductive for the county.
And that was one of our primary discussions in this revision, was to try to limit those variances.
One of the additional responsibilities for the PC was also defining and flushing out the legacy splits. And so that's not reflected here, but that is on their 2023.
Yeah, but that may change it. With this language, I'm not sure we need a legacy split category because legacies, you know, we have A35, but yet we have a lot of people who have bigger ground, so we're trying to do it. But as long as something's left bigger than 35, in the legacies, you broke off a 5-acre piece or a 2-acre piece, you'd have left, I'm not sure we need it. I think this addresses it. Again, it's also going to be a function of water. You know, if the water's available, then they can do it, split it off into a 5-acre, 2-acre, and rezone. And I think that's the point of the rezone is if the neighborhood starts to change that way, we then do put it on the map. It may be a spot today, but the neighbors say, you know, I want to split this off, and now we've got two next to each other that have gone from A20s to A5s with multiple, and that's how the zoning takes shape. I mean, our maps are going to take a lot longer to really take shape than we'll probably be alive. I mean, it's going to take a long time.
And again, those maps are never gonna be perfect.
Never intended to be. They were broad brush
They
strokes.
are meant to be a guide.
Yeah, it's a first blush. We've got to let the process sort of define how it is. So it is, there's no intent to stop somebody from doing what you want. Somebody needs to break it off. We just try to come up with language that would keep it from everybody going to a variance.
And if that was the desire, that there'd be the conversation around a rezone versus a variance.
Yeah.
So the rezone conversation comes to the planning commission with a recommendation of the board, where a variance goes to the board of adjustment.
Don, how would you change this to meet your concerns?
Like I said before, if I knew how many hours we spent discussing this single topic, it's astronomical, and we never did, I feel, come up with a truly good answer to it.
I think we got it wrong in the first iteration. That's the point. Everybody was getting a variance. And I think that after a year or two use, like, hey, let's not keep doing this. Let's change it. And that's sort of what prompted this.
This is another one I would like to see some real valuable public input on, to see if there's some better ideas on there.
Sure.
primarily subsection C2, the remainder, or the whole thing?
All of C,
Okay.
all of C.
Yeah, highlight C in green. All of it in sub A, or two, yeah. There you go.
3.3 or 3.3.6.
Well, all of it, but in particular, subsection C.
And this is what you referred back to the planning commission, that
Yes.
we spent a number of hours trying to figure it out with 9 different people banging around, and I think Kate was really going this sort of spirited, let's try this. And we don't know if it's perfect or it's gonna work till we start to implement it, but we think it's better than what was there before. People can do what they wanna do without having to go to variance.
It's that argument between good and perfect.
Yeah.
Mike, anything?
No.
And then just to highlight the last part, where
See
before,
it in your eyes.
the,
Well, I don't know. You still, I guess rezoning is just the only option. We're just going to have to be spot zoned. That's my concern. So,
But zoning does change over time. As the county grows and we get more people, it
Well,
has to change.
and the part with rezoning is that there are criteria in your land use code for rezoning, and if it meets the criteria, I would argue that it's not spot zoning, because you've looked at it. You've looked at not just that parcel, but what's around it, and made a decision of why that should be a different zoning. And where spot zoning starts to get into trouble is like, I'm just gonna do it for you, Wendell, but not you, Don, and you're right next door to each other, without some type of basis or justification for it. John, would you comfortable with? Sure.
Let's flag that, see what comes up.
I mean, the other thing I want to highlight there is that last item E, where before it was the final plat be annotated that no further subdivision of either lot created be allowed. So it was an in perpetuity. So that's now 10 years. So you could re-subdivide it again in 10 years, provided you meet the criteria. It also, because this came up as an issue of, there was a remainder that was more than 70 acres, and that's not subject to the subdivision requirement, so they can still do that under the state exemption.
Correct.
So that we would try to capture that in here as well to make sure that didn't get misconstrued. So if you want something other than the 10 years, if that helps at all in
Again,
this discussion, or,
I want to see what the public has to say on that.
okay, I just wanted to say that that's another area that can help.
And I've given my argument to this many times over, so. Farmer Jones sells off the parcel because he got cancer, I sure hope he gets it again in 10 years, so.
Anything else in chapter 3, gentlemen? I will note that at 12:15, we're going to break for lunch for 45 minutes. So it'll be a quick lunch, come back, give everybody a chance to stretch your legs. Chapter 4.
I don't have any changes in chapter 4 unless you do.
Say that again.
Really, nothing in 4?
Okay, well, let's go back and review 4 then.
Well,
What do you guys wanna go over?
5, moving on.
Moving on.
Mr. Sukas.
The first change I have in chapter 5 is page 117 relative to cisterns.
So, page 101,
Regarding,
regarding traffic impacts.
okay,
In the application section, I think there's that last two sentences that I think we don't need. The part where it says that, in addition, a traffic impact study may be required if the director determines the location or size of the proposed development would impact traffic conditions in the surrounding areas. That's pretty dang vague. And then secondly, when a traffic study is required, the study shall be completed by a Colorado registered professional engineer. And I do believe there are traffic study companies that are not registered engineers.
RFPs.
Yeah. So I don't know that we want to put that restriction. These things are costly enough.
Both of these came as a recommendation from one of the engineers that was working on a couple of projects doing a traffic impact study. The latter part, the second one about the registered professional engineer, there was a fair amount of questioning the traffic study for the Garnet Mesa project, both at the Planning Commission and the board, and I believe also with the concrete batch plant, the traffic study that was done for that. There's a specific accreditation as a traffic engineer. I don't think this would include that, separate from a PE.
Is there a state standard to reference, so it's?
There's a federal standard. There is a traffic manual, traffic testing manual, and it refers to the engine, a certified engineer. We take out professional, but we don't.
Well, I just.
Is there a CDOT standard?
Let's make sure that we're, minimizing instead of maximizing requirements here. And if that is in the state code that it has to be a licensed engineer, then I'll stand corrected, but I had thought there was companies out there that were not. So.
What would they be if they're not? I mean, they're not, I don't know if a traffic engineer, if they're, is separate from a professional engineer, But what do you accept as a traffic study? If you don't have some standard, I don't know, I'm trying to figure that out. Because they come in, they say, hey, we got this traffic study. It was done by my friend.
So the PE covers civil, mining.
It does, and traffic.
I don't know about traffic.
Yeah, right, okay.
PE is pretty broad.
I guess we just need to find out what true traffic engineers act, what they have as to give them qualified engineering. It may not be PE.
The other way to reference that would be a QP, qualified person.
It would appear that CDOT has a document called a recommended outline for traffic impact study. I've got that same reference.
And then the next paragraph where it says, in addition, the director may require a higher level traffic impact study when more information is needed to evaluate the project. Once again, that's pretty vague. I mean, if we're gonna be requiring something, it should be pretty specific in our code. I mean, that language could apply to every single application pretty much out there, so.
And the scope of study identified in the next section, I think we could strike sentence 2 in that. Because then the
we can take it out. The reason it was put in there was again, contention through some of the projects that have come through, that the traffic engineer said, well, it didn't meet the threshold to go to a level 2. It was just a level 1, but there was a lot of questions about, well, how are you going to mitigate, how you do things, which are higher level reviews, because it didn't meet the 20%. People questioning that it did or didn't meet the 20%. And we could just hold to that, and if it doesn't meet the 20%, then there's no further review. We won't address it then.
So I just
What do you think?
found a dated document, so it's from 2008, but it's just jumping out. It says, when a traffic study, this is a CDOT document, when a traffic impact study is required, it shall be completed and sealed by a professional engineer registered in the state of Colorado, preferably with specific training in traffic and transportation engineering.
So they were looking for a PD also.
They're looking for a PD.
What do our neighboring counties require on that? Any idea?
Can't find it that fast.
No, I was asking Carl.
Oh.
I don't know offhand.
Okay. We could maybe look at what our neighboring counties are asking for on that. and,
Okay.
Just to make sure we're not being overly burdensome.
We don't, by standard, ask for a traffic study unless there's some cause, right?
Mhm.
It's not like we're required to do it. It's some.
That's why we've got the whole table 5A, you know, with the study scope, to make sure, that, you know, that part of my thought is, I'm thinking is in terms of the applicant, okay? The last thing the applicant, when he reads through our code, when he gets ready to develop the project, you know, the last thing he or she wants to do is come in and get surprised, say, oh, well, you know, we really need this, even though we don't specifically call it out in our tables. That's my concerns on this. Okay. And we can move on to systems.
Okay. Page 117, Carl.
Okay, so section of cisterns, there's been comments relative to that, whether it could be used. I added at the end of the A3 residential unit and 1 ADU. That's consistent with what we've been talking about a little bit earlier. We've also added the definition of ADU in chapter 14 to include the same list of types of structures, dwelling units, which does include RVs, mobile homes, manufactured homes, yurts, etc. And then in item C, there was a question about grandfathering. The intent there is to try to capture that if you have an existing property that's been developed with cisterns, where the cisterns were not regulated before, that is grandfathered in. It's only if you want to expand or increase, intensify that, is when this section would come into play. So that's why the January 5th, 2021 date is in there, setting that as that threshold. Anything prior to that is grandfathered in if it was developed with a cistern because it wasn't regulated and such. Then also the...
So, real quick, let's back up a step to number 1 on that, about the property being located within the service area or growth management area of a purveyor municipality. My concern here, you know, and I'm not talking for development, you know, and I think we make that clear for new development on top. But for an existing property that wants to build a house, and, you know, some of these water companies can be pretty onerous because it's within the area, but not only are they going to charge a large tap fee, they're going to require conveyance of water rights. some of these are also requiring that the line be upgraded by whoever's purchasing that tap. You know, and, you know, I don't want us to have our language stating such that, you know, somebody's got a piece of property that's not really much use for, but putting a house on, and they're gonna do a cistern, but they're within an area of a purveyor, and it's $100,000 price tag for them to get water to their property. And we're gonna say, no, you can't have a cistern because it is available, even though it's cost prohibitive to that point. You understand what I'm saying?
I do, and I don't know all the specific statutes around special districts, but there is another section in the land use code that speaks to special districts and refers to it cites a statute, as well as the growth management area. We have our intergovernmental agreements that do speak to, you know, how that works within those areas.
See, and my concern is less in the municipal water providers. You know, my concern is in these smaller water companies. You know, that's where my concern lies. And listing them as purveyor / municipality still includes them in that discussion.
Let me play devil's advocate here. So I'm XYZ water company at the very end of the line, and somebody wants to add a tap on there. How do we get development to pay its own way then? If it's going to put the rest of the system at jeopardy, at risk, how does development pay its own way?
So are we going to condemn that property because it's so cost prohibitive to run a water tap that, you know, that any use of that property is there no longer would because.
But there is a hardship clause in here.
In the cisterns, there's a hardship clause?
Yes, on top of page 118. Where an owner is able to demonstrate the diligence to exhaust available remedies noted above, and the strict application of this code would result in peculiar and exceptional practical difficulties to or exceptional undue hardship upon the owner of the subject property, the Board of Adjustment may authorize a variance from the requirements. There is a hardship clause here. So in that extreme case, because again, I heard loud and clear that municipalities, Crawford in particular at that time, does not favor additional cisterns where they are on the hook to provide water.
Oh, and absolutely, I totally understand that.
Yeah. Somebody builds $1 million home and relies on a cistern, and all of a sudden you can't get reliable water from any municipality standpipes.
No, I totally get it, but, you know, you have that existing parcel out there that Joe Blow's been paying taxes on for the last 50 years.
And wants to build a retirement.
Wants to build his retirement home, and it is, you know, this hardship clause should cover that. Okay.
But I think we do want to encourage responsible development, particularly when it comes to water.
Oh, absolutely, I totally 100% agree. I just don't want that encouragement to become a condemnation law.
And I think kind of where part of this is, again, more to the special district, where a special district has been established. We don't have control over that. Special district may say no taps unless you come through us. And I think that's what the land use code is trying to capture back on page 91, where it has special district water providers. It refers to the Special District Act, the statute.
Does that fit your thoughts, Mike?
John, can the special water district bring a suit because the guy that wants to build his retirement home doesn't tap into their line?
Anybody can bring a suit. I don't know, Mike. I mean, I'm happy to look into that, but those are, I mean, that is the purpose in this factual scenario. I mean, that's the purpose of that special district, is to provide the water. So I think it needs to be a case by case where, you know, that can come to the board, but I think the board also would be hearing that input from that special district at that point. Why should this be different? And I think that's what Chairman Coons is talking about, of these hardships and that sort of thing, hardship scenarios.
Like,
I
I'm
think
not
you
aware
wanna
of
just-
any of the private water companies have a mandate where if you're within so many feet of their line, you have to tap in. I think it's what you're addressing. Municipalities do. But the private companies have no mandate that you have to use their water.
Thank you.
I think is that sort of addressing, I think that's where you're going. Could somebody sue to say you have to use it?
They see the $100,000 tap fee, hey, this will help us upstate, and
Yeah, I don't think they can force you to use their water.
But this is.
No, this is saying if the municipalities are doing it.
It's
Municipalities
within the
say,
service area. So it could be a small water company.
the water companies don't have a mandate, that you have to use it. And the code wouldn't say, we can't force the water company to make you use their water.
I think maybe that number one needs to be fixed in chapter 6.
So that, there's no other changes in chapter 5, and I didn't have anything in chapter 6
Public
unless you.
comment.
Mike, Don, anything else?
I still, this is one of these issues on chapter 6 that needs to be addressed. Our fire impact fees, I still don't feel are statutorily in compliance. I get real nervous about those, so I would like us to make sure that I know we've got a big ask list in 2023 on things we're looking at land use code wise, but I'd like impact fees to be.
That was a recommendation from the planning commission, was to do an exit study to identify what is required there.
Because our blanket fee is not even close to what statute calls out for when it comes to impact fees.
Okay.
Anything else in chapter 6? Commissioner Lane? Okay. Chapter 7, Carl?
Chapter 7, this is where we start to get into the procedural part of the site plan review changes and the development application process. So addressing is not a permit, we assign addresses, so made that clarification. Made a clarification relative to OWTS because there's been questions about, well, I want to do composting, I want to have an incinerator toilet. That is all types of wastewater treatment systems that are engineered. So we included a parenthetical to make that clear. And then again, trying to clarify what's a permit versus a review or an approval. And that's what that first paragraph is really doing. The OWTS. And then on the next page, again, it's not an address permit. We assign addresses. There's some additional changes there. Felt that we should refer to the address design standards, address regulations, since that is a separate document. And this would be an appropriate location to do that, both for addressing and naming of roads. Section to move that further. I think that was it.
Do you have anything in
Until we get to
chapter 7?
page 136. The rest is just OWTS changes.
I didn't have anything else to say.
Have something here for me, make sure. So I guess, page 134. We talk about stale applications. I guess once again, back to rule of law instead of the rule of man. It says an application of 6 months to meet the director's requirements. Should that be the requirements of code? Or,
Yes, that's fine. I mean, that is that's what I'm charged to do
right, well, and
as the
that's.
director.
Well, and
Whether the
that's,
director is,
yeah, I like to say, it may be semantics here, but it's still, you know, I guess one of the concepts I have here, you know, that's why we have the code, so we're following the code instead of following a person. You understand my thoughts there? Okay. That's all I have to say.
so change directors to code departments. Number 3. Also.
Oh, I see in the last part of that sentence. Anything else? 7. Chapter 8, review processes. Do we want to hang on to this one until after lunch, guys? Or we can get through this one before we do lunch? Let's go ahead and jump into it.
Okay. So this first part, again, is clarifying site plan review standards. And rather than being general and just referring to the various chapters, 2, 3, 4, 5, to be specific that when it's subject to site plan review, there are some standards, use-specific standards in chapter 2, like we were talking about with airports and whatever, so there's that. But then other than that, relative to chapter 3, what we're really talking about is setbacks. So just specifying that. Encumbrances like easements or plat notes that would be on the property, water supply, and sanitary sewage disposal, OWTS, and the access permit. So as we're going through site plan review, we're working with the county engineer. If it's a new development, that the access is in a place that engineering will approve when the access permit comes through. So that there isn't a site plan that shows an access and then it gets hung up once it moves on to engineering. It should be pretty straightforward. Then the next section where there's highlight is relative to other approvals and permits and referencing the other things that some of them that the county does. Like we look at the floodplain, we have floodplain administrator, which is in the environmental health director, but then there are state electrical permits and state plumbing permits that are established by various statutes. And then other ordinances, as I mentioned, floodplain regulations, pre-HUD ordinance, removing reference to anything about building codes or business licenses, referencing the Highway 92, Highway 50 overlay districts, those are ordinances. We felt that make sure that until or unless those are repealed, that they be referenced in the intergovernmental agreements. So that's what all those changes are getting to there.
And I know we called out electrical and plumbing by statute.
Correct.
Don't disappoint me.
Well, our overlay districts are something that we need to address, obviously, so, I still feel we're perhaps, a little bit of taxation without representation in those districts, but we need to get those addressed. And you remove business licensing regulations because the county has more authority for business licenses by
Correct.
statutes.
Correct.
Yes. Mike, you have anything on this one?
No.
We covered what I had previously flagged.
Okay. On page 147 then, this is part of a conditional use permit process. Mostly this will come into play with the renewable energy facilities. Requires a waste management plan, shall include plans for recycling materials and waste diversion, which was a request of your board back in December.
Correct.
So that language works. The next change I have is on page 150 relative to annual reports. And similar to the annual operating report where it says where required, adding that to the annual report as well. So if it's required by resolution, then it would apply, not just in all cases.
Any question on that? That was something further on that behalf. Annual reports and AOPs.
I also brought it up too because if we have a permit out there that doesn't require any, we don't want to get held over our head because the code calls for those.
And that's all I have in chapter 8. Chapter 9 is relative to appeals if you want, or do you want that break?
I'm ready to actually jump into 9 real quick, but I don't think that will take much.
So in chapter 9, relative to appeals, there was concerns relative to the timeline. We shortened the timeline for the appeal period from what was in the 2021 code for the benefit of the applicant, to make sure that things are moving along. There was some question about what if the applicant themselves wanted more time, and that's fine, it's their due process. So we added the language that would be the aggrieved party, other than the applicant, has 15 days. However, the applicant can take up to 60 days. And we did that both at the Board of Adjustment level and the Board of County Commissioner level.
So something that I wrote a note here, and I don't know, perhaps it's someplace else in this document, and I'm not placing it, but in the event of a denial, I would like to have something perhaps that we as a planning department give the applicant in writing what their options are going forward as far as a potential appeals process or any processes that can help them be successful in the application.
So appeal at the between the Planning Commission and the Board?
I'm just
Because
saying.
when the Board takes action, it's a final action.
Right, once the board takes action, I get that. I'm thinking more of when the director denies, Board of Adjustment denies, that there's a process of a written document that the applicant gets that says, okay, you've been denied such and such date on this number. These are the things that you can do moving forward to appeal this application.
Okay.
I'm sure it's done in process. I just think it's one of those, points that we need to make sure people are aware
So a separate sort of appeals guideline.
We do a
that we
follow-up
could just-
letter typically after Board of Adjustment, whether it's approved or, you know, denied or whatever it might be, here's your next steps. But we'll take that and kind of build that into the standard procedures to make sure that it gets captured.
I just think it's a real important part to make sure that everybody's got the right information of what their possible actions are.
Sure.
And I could see that applying to any conditions of approval too.
Yep. As I mentioned, what we've been doing, for example, Board of Adjustment will approve a variance. We'll say your variance was approved subject to these conditions by the Board of Adjustment. Your next step, if it's a minor plat, it's administrative review. Here's the process for that. If it's a preliminary plat, here's the process goes to planning commission to the board. We haven't had any real denials to test that. The one variance that got denied, they revised it per the direction of the Board of Adjustment and then went through the preliminary plat process.
Like I said,
Yeah,
just so that there's always a path forward.
agreed.
Okay.
So if that can include chapter 9 and 10, since there really isn't a
Did
chapter 10.
you have anything on mind?
Answered my question.
Okay. Chapter 10 has been reserved, it's empty. When we come back from lunch at 1 o'clock, we're going to pick up chapter 11. Commissioners, thank you.